The night is alive with chaos, shouts, smoke, and fire twisting together like a fever dream. The camera moves through a street consumed by flames. A voice breaks through the noise. When justice fails, rage takes its place. If you had stood in America during one of its great riots, you wouldn't have witnessed protest. You would have witnessed an explosion of the human spirit at its breaking point. The United States has always claimed to be a land of freedom, of progress. But sometimes that same spirit boils over into destruction. And when it does, the streets tell a story the textbooks rarely do. The first great American riot wasn't about race or politics. It was about class, fear, and survival. The year was 1863. The Civil War had torn the nation apart, and the Union Army was desperate for soldiers. So the government introduced the draft. But there was a catch. If you were rich, you could pay $300 to avoid it. If you were poor, especially an Irish immigrant scraping by on the edge of starvation, you were going to war. The anger started small. Whispers in taverns, clenched fists at factory gates. Then came the spark. On a hot July morning in New York City, crowds gathered to protest the draft. Within hours, the protest turned into chaos. Draft offices were burned to the ground. Rioters tore through wealthy neighborhoods, looting mansions and businesses. But the fury didn't stop there. It twisted into something darker, a racial war. Black citizens were hunted through the streets, beaten, lynched, burned alive. An orphanage for black children was set on fire. The police were overwhelmed. The army had to march from the battlefields to reclaim the city. By the time the smoke cleared, more than 100 people were dead, and the city lay in ruins. The New York Draft Riots revealed a terrifying truth, that the line between civilization and madness is far thinner than we like to believe. Decades later, that same fury would resurface in a different form. This time, not from the poor against the rich, but from white America against black success. In 1921, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Greenwood district stood as one of the most prosperous black communities in the nation. It was a place where freedom had taken root, where former slaves built businesses, owned homes, and proved that black excellence could thrive. But to many white residents, that success was intolerable. When a young black man named Dick Rowland was accused, falsely, of assaulting a white woman, the city ignited. A white mob gathered outside the courthouse, demanding his life. Armed black veterans arrived to protect him. Someone fired a shot, and the city descended into hell. For 2 days, white mobs looted, burned, and killed. Airplanes flew overhead, dropping firebombs on homes and churches. The National Guard stood by as the district was obliterated. 35 blocks of Greenwood vanished in smoke. Hundreds were killed. Thousands were left homeless. And then, as if it never happened, America erased it. Newspapers were silenced. Schools never mentioned it. The survivors were forced to rebuild in silence, while insurance companies refused to pay a cent. Tulsa was renamed in the national memory, not a massacre, but a riot. A convenient word to shift blame from the murderers to the murdered. But that's the thing about fire. You can bury the ashes, but the smoke always finds a way to rise again. The Great Depression came next, and with it, another kind of rage. Across the country, workers who'd lost everything began to realize that the system had no mercy for them. In San Francisco, 1934, dock workers went on strike. They weren't asking for much. A living wage, shorter hours, the right to unionize. But the powerful shipping companies refused. The strike spread, and the police were sent in to crush it. July 5th, Bloody Thursday. The streets erupted. Police fired into crowds of unarmed men. 2 workers were killed. Dozens were wounded. The city shut down. Rioters overturned streetcars, barricaded roads, and turned the waterfront into a war zone. The chaos terrified the elites, but it also forced the country to listen. Out of that uprising came one of the most important labor victories in American history, the right for workers to organize freely. Change had come, but it was written in blood. The years rolled on, and America's cities kept burning, not because people loved violence, but because they felt they had no other voice left. When the system ignored them, the fire spoke for them. In 1943, Los Angeles erupted again. The city was divided, white servicemen on one side, Mexican-American youth on the other. The media had painted the youth as delinquents, criminals, un-American. Their style, the wide pants, long coats, and bright ties of the zoot suit, became a target. When a fight broke out between sailors and a group of zoot-suited teens, the city lost its mind. White mobs, some in uniform, rampaged through Mexican neighborhoods. They dragged young men from movie theaters, tore off their clothes, and beat them in the streets. Police joined in, arresting the victims, not the attackers. The newspapers called it patriotic. For days, the violence went unchecked. When it was finally over, not a single rioter was punished. The blame was placed on the community that had been attacked. For many Mexican Americans, the message was clear. In America, identity itself could be treated as a crime. By mid-century, America had burned from east to west, from draft riots to race wars to labor revolts. And each time, the reasons changed, but the cause stayed the same. The feeling that justice was never meant for everyone. The riots weren't random explosions. They were mirrors, brutal, merciless mirrors, showing the nation what it refused to see about itself. If you think those days are over, that humanity has somehow evolved past that kind of chaos, look closely at the headlines today. The anger still simmers, just beneath the surface. And the question remains, when people stop believing the system will save them, how long before the fire starts again? By the 1940s, America was fighting fascism overseas, but at home, another kind of war was already brewing in its streets. The tension between promise and hypocrisy was unbearable. Freedom for all, they said. But that freedom came with conditions, with colors, with unspoken lines you could not cross. In 1943, Detroit was an industrial powerhouse, the city of the automobile, of jobs, of opportunity. But beneath the hum of factory machines was something poisonous. Black workers, many from the South, had come north chasing the American dream. White workers felt that dream was being stolen from them. Neighborhoods were segregated, police bias was open, and resentment pulsed like a heartbeat. Then, one hot June evening, the city erupted. A fight broke out between black and white youths on Belle Isle, a park divided by racial tension. Rumors spread faster than truth ever could. Within hours, mobs surged through the city. White gangs stormed through Paradise Valley, the Black District, dragging people from streetcars, looting shops, burning homes. Black residents armed themselves, defending their neighborhoods with whatever they could find. The police, overwhelmingly white, cracked down with brutal force, but only in one direction. By the time federal troops arrived, the streets were soaked in fear. 34 people were dead, most of them black. Nearly 2,000 were injured or arrested. President Roosevelt called it tragedy. But for Detroit's black citizens, it wasn't tragedy. It was revelation. They'd seen, once again, what justice really meant in America. 2 decades later, the flames would return, higher and brighter than ever before. The year was 1965, Los Angeles. The Watts district was one of the poorest in the city, overcrowded, underpoliced, and forgotten. One warm August evening, a white highway patrolman pulled over a young black man named Marquette Fry for drunk driving. The stop spiraled into a physical fight. A crowd gathered. When Fry's mother was shoved by an officer, something in the air snapped. The crowd exploded. For 6 days, Watts became a war zone. Buildings burned, stores were looted, cars overturned. The air shimmered with heat and smoke. Reporters called it an orgy of violence. But to the people of Watts, it was the only language left that power would listen to. By the time it ended, 34 were dead, more than 1,000 injured, and over 4,000 arrested. $200 million in damage. When asked why, one resident said, "Because we're tired of being tired." The message echoed across the country. Detroit heard it. Newark heard it. Every city that had buried its poor and ignored its black citizens heard it. And soon, the flames came for them too. In the summer of 1967, the United States looked less like a beacon of democracy and more like a battlefield. There were more than 150 riots that year, a season of rage that tore across the map. Detroit's was the loudest. It began on July 23rd, when police raided an unlicensed bar where black veterans were celebrating. As officers dragged people out, angry onlookers gathered. Then came the first bottle. Then the first window shattered. Then everything fell apart. Within hours, entire blocks were on fire. The National Guard was deployed. Tanks rolled down residential streets. Snipers were reported on rooftops, sometimes real, sometimes imagined, always answered with gunfire. Residents fled their homes as the city turned to smoke. 43 people were killed, most of them by police or troops. Thousands were arrested. Journalists called it the death of Detroit, but for many, it was the moment America was forced to look in the mirror and finally see the truth it had avoided for centuries. The people weren't destroying their city for the sake of chaos. They were tearing down the walls that had caged them their entire lives. As the 1960s burned to their end, the pattern was unmistakable. The system promised equality, but delivered nothing but excuses. Politicians condemned the riots, but ignored the conditions that caused them. They said the rioters were criminals, thugs, ungrateful, but never asked why they had been pushed that far in the first place. The camera lingers on the charred remains of a storefront, the letters of a burned sign, half visible in the ash. Freedom Grocery, irony and smoke, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. By the early 1970s, America was exhausted. Cities still scarred from fires. Police departments militarized. A generation raised on hope and rebellion, left wondering what change actually meant. The fires went quiet, but not because peace had been found. It was because the flames had gone underground, waiting for the next injustice, the next spark, the next reason to remember that sometimes the past never really ends. It just hides in plain sight. And soon, in a small city in California, that fire would roar again, louder than ever before. By the early 1990s, America liked to believe it had moved beyond the days of burning cities. Civil rights legislation had been passed, segregation outlawed, equality written on paper. But beneath the surface, nothing fundamental had changed. The anger, the distrust, the constant pressure of injustice, all of it simmered beneath the calm of suburbia. Then, on a dark night in Los Angeles, someone hit record. March 3, 1991. Rodney King, a black man, was pulled over after a high-speed chase. He was unarmed. He was on the ground. He was surrounded by officers. And the world watched as those officers beat him again and again and again, as if he wasn't human at all. 81 seconds of footage that would define a generation. The tape spread across the country. For many, it was proof of what they'd always known, but could never show. For others, it was a revelation, a shattering of illusions. When the 4 officers were brought to trial in 1992, Los Angeles held its breath. The verdict came down on April 29th. Not guilty. All of them. And in that moment, something inside the city snapped. The first rocks flew within minutes. Then came the fires. Entire blocks went up in smoke. Helicopters hovered above the city like vultures. Looters filled the streets. Police were overwhelmed. Reporters broadcast live as truck driver Reginald Denny was pulled from his cab and beaten nearly to death. The National Guard arrived, then the Marines. For 6 days, Los Angeles burned. By the time it was over, 63 people were dead, more than 2,300 injured, and over 12,000 arrested. $1 billion in damage. But the numbers didn't tell the real story. The real story was the roar of a people who had been told to be patient for far too long. America watched in horror. Politicians called for peace. Commentators spoke of lawlessness. But in South Central, where families had been crushed by poverty and police brutality for generations, they didn't see chaos. They saw a reckoning. A painful, desperate demand to be heard. The only way power ever seemed to listen. Decades passed, but the echoes of those flames never faded. They lived on in quiet anger, intense traffic stops, in every protest chant that followed. Then, in 2020, a knee pressed into the neck of a man in Minneapolis, and the fire returned once more. The world changed in a single breath. "I can't breathe." George Floyd's final words became a rallying cry that crossed oceans. Protests erupted not just across America, but around the world. The images were hauntingly familiar. Streets filled with smoke, crowds facing riot shields, anger and grief mingling in the air. But this time, there were cameras everywhere. Millions watched live as history repeated itself. Some called it the largest civil rights movement in American history. Others called it chaos. But beneath every protest sign, every broken window, every tear gas cloud, was the same ancient truth, that justice, when denied long enough, always finds a voice. And that voice isn't polite. It isn't quiet. It doesn't wait for permission. For centuries, America has wrestled with its own reflection, a nation that promises liberty while fearing the people who demand it. From the Boston streets of 1770 to the burning avenues of 2020, the story has always been the same. Oppression, explosion, silence, repeat. What begins as a whisper of frustration always ends in fire. Every riot is a mirror, a brutal one. It forces a nation to see what it's tried to forget, that the violence of the oppressed is often born from the violence of the system itself. You can rebuild buildings, sweep away debris, paint over graffiti, but you can't erase history. You can't erase the rage that comes from being unseen. As the smoke clears, the question that remains is the same one asked for generations. How many times must a nation burn before it learns to listen?